A warm welcome to you on the Gavel. I'm Linda Akibi. The National Assembly has finally approved the restructuring of the controversial 22.719 trillion naira Ways and Means advances. The Ways and Means advances can be described loosely as an overdraft given to the federal government by the Central Bank of Nigeria for emergency funding of delayed receipts of fiscal deficit. Now, the Senate was the first to approve the restructuring, explaining that it did this to ensure that the government does not shut down. The House of Representatives followed suit a day after. Now, this request for restructuring of 22.719 trillion naira was a contentious ask by the President Buhari in December last year, as some lawmakers and analysts were alarmed at the huge debt burden and questioned why the federal government repeatedly borrowed from the Central Bank of Nigeria in excess of the 5% threshold of the previous year's revenue as stipulated by the CBN Act. In this report, we'll take you through the series of events and reactions that followed President Buhari's request to the National Assembly to restructure the monies borrowed from the CBN. President Buhari's request for the National Assembly to restructure the sum of 22.719 trillion naira Ways and Means advances was met with suspicion and opposition by federal lawmakers in the Senate. The President, in his letter to the Senate, which was read on the floor on December 21, 2022, explains that the Ways and Means advances given to the federal government by the Central Bank of Nigeria are for emergency funding of delayed receipt of fiscal deficits. The Ways and Means request was raised for debate on the floor of the Senate on December 28, 2022.
81 to 83.
Some senators were opposed to approving the overdraft, explaining that it contravenes the Constitution and the CBN Act. This caused a rowdy session on the floor.
Listen. Yes.
Mr. President, Section 81, 82 of the Nigerian Constitution, 81 to 83, states clearly how expenditure can be made by the government. One of it is through budgeting. The next is through supplementary budget as provided in the Constitution. Now, I don't know where the law comes from, where we have to spend money or restructure expenditures through Ways and Means.
Distinguished, excuse me, please, just let me say something. There is nothing before the Senate now. There is nothing. Technically, the report needs to be presented and then you can raise your issue.
Mr. President, the report cannot be presented because we have no laws in the land of Nigeria that covers anything called weight.
No, why the report should be presented is for us to know what happened.
The issue is that such payments, such money that are taken, as soon as they are taken, the Senate should be informed. And then we look at it all, we should be advanced with information, a request that such money is going to be taken. Because it's being taken on behalf of the people of Nigeria. And we are entrusted with the power to make laws. And we will not appropriate, according to the law of the Constitution, we can appropriate. They don't just ask for the fund. The fund must be asked in accordance with a requirement or request that we are using this fund for A, B, C, D, E every year. And that in the next year, if they want to take another one, this one should have been paid. Should have been paid at the end of the year that it was granted. Now, we are giving a bulk sum of 22.7 trillion. 23 years. Hold on. 23 that is added to the 850 or something billion. That one has to be a part. That's not the problem. But the 22.719 trillion, Mr. President, it will be an abuse of our personal selves and against our privilege that we come here and it was requested that we have spent this money on behalf of Nigerians in the past 7 or 6 years and approve it without details.
Thereafter, the Senate set up an ad hoc committee to liaise with the CBN and Ministry of Finance to get details of what the monies were spent on. The matter was hotly debated across the country, with analysts describing the huge amount of overdraft as an example of fiscal indiscipline by the federal government and the CBN, and alarmed that the move would hike Nigeria's official debt load by more than half, propelling the country's debt stock to 77 trillion naira by May 2023, according to a forecast by the Debt Management Office. They also faulted the National Assembly for allowing the federal government disregard the CBN Act, restricting outstanding loans to 5% of the previous year's budget and mandating that the funding be repaid within the same financial year.
They should now chart a pragmatic path, the path of least pain, the path that will cost the treasury the least, because the law has been violated and there's nothing anybody can do.
Federal government can run to a bank, in this case the central bank, which is the government bank, to collect an advance. But according to the Act, it must not be more than 5% of the central bank's, of the federal government's previous year's revenue at any time. So nobody has raised concerns about Ways and Means until recently. Last year, November, it was published that 6.3 trillion in 10 months was collected by federal government. That is from January to October. The federal government has collected almost equivalent when you prorate the expected revenue for last year. When you prorate it, that's what government collected in Ways. So the caution around Ways and Means has been thrown into the air. And government just saw that as another loan means without, and you know, because it's an advance, it's more like quote and unquote another overdraft of some sort. You don't go to National Assembly for such because you know you are anyways going to pay back almost immediately. Your spending will still be within what the National Assembly has approved. But
on Wednesday, May 3rd, the ad hoc committee, which the Senate set up to liaise with the CBN, presented its report during plenary session. In the report, the committee stated that most of the requests for increase in Ways and Means were made to the President on the need to finance the budget because of revenue shortfalls. Part of the Ways and Means monies were given to state governments as loans to augment budgetary shortfalls in various states. Because of a serious shortfall in government revenue, the federal government was compelled to borrow repeatedly from the CBN, exceeding the 5% threshold of the previous year's revenue as stipulated by the CBN Act. The Ministry of Finance has concluded plans to convert the CBN loans to treasury bills and bonds. For the committee, approving the Ways and Means advances is a fait accompli.
The Special Committee, after exhaustive deliberations, recommends as follows: that the restructuring sum of 22 trillion 719 million 703 719 billion 703 million 774,306.9 only for Ways and Means advances be approved, because the advances were made to ensure that the government does not shut down. And this is something that we are always looking for. 2, that the Senate further approves the sum of 180 billion 463 million 62,187, being the money, the interest accrued on the money. You know, only being the balance of the supplementary budget and the interest accrued on Ways and Means advances.
Ways and Means is not peculiar to our country. They become necessities, but there are procedures and processes and better ways of incurring them. First of all, the National Assembly is always there to consider the request of the executive in the national interest. And I don't see any National Assembly standing against any infrastructural development, building roads, bridges, and so on and so forth. So it is very, very important that the executive, before they incur this kind of huge Ways and Means, they should, in fact, it's a must that they seek the approval of the National Assembly. And where, for whatever reason, an emergency happened, it shouldn't take this kind of period before a request is sent to the National Assembly for approval.
The following day, on Tuesday, May 4th, the House of Representatives approved the 22.719 trillion naira Ways and Means request of President Buhari. Meanwhile, the Senate has passed through second reading a bill to ensure strict implementation and enforcement of the National Assembly's recommendations on the annual reports from the Auditor General. The sponsor of the bill, Senator Matthew Urogide, in his lead debate, explains that the bill is key to fighting corruption, as it will ensure that the recommendations of the Auditor General in the audited annual financial accounts of government ministries, departments and agencies are enforced.
The Auditor General for the Federation and his team spent enormous time to audit the account of the Federation and made recommendations which over the years have been ignored to the perils of all of us. Mr. President, my distinguished colleagues, the goal of this bill, therefore, is to ensure that a legal framework exists for the strict implementation and enforcement of the National Assembly timely decisions reached on audit reports of the Auditor General made on national annual financial dealings. This is to ensure that a level of seriousness is accorded to the audit process, while violations are strictly sanctioned within specified timelines. The bill will ensure that national audits are not just an exercise in futility, and it will be a roll call of any MDAs to understand that audit infractions can attract speedy and painful consequences. These success stories will be valuable crowns on the National Assembly and on the head of the Auditor General, making him a champion in the war against corruption.
On April 5th, the Senate adopted the recommendations of a 2016 Auditor General's report, which queried several federal government ministries, departments and agencies for financial infractions. In the 2016 report, the Auditor General issued queries to 92 MDAs, 80 of which submitted written responses and appeared before the committee to defend the queries against them. 8 submitted memoranda in response to the queries but did not appear before the committee, while 4 MDAs failed to either appear or submit written responses to the committee, despite several reminders to that effect. Some of the financial infractions observed by the committee in the report include irregular remittances of internally generated revenue by revenue-generating agencies, high incidences of non-remittance of deducted taxes to government coffers by ministries, departments and agencies, diversion of government properties to private use, award of contracts to incompetent contractors. Some key offenders of financial infractions in the report include the NNPC for poor record keeping for uplifting of crude oil to the Warri and Kaduna refineries without necessary details or breakdown of what was delivered to the respective companies worth 102.6 billion naira. The National Population Commission for non-maintenance of proper records at its transport section, making it difficult to account for the total number and locations of the Commission's vehicles. The NDLEA for overspending 12.9 million naira capital expenditure. Senators are worried that the executive will not implement its recommendations from its investigation of the Auditor General's report. To address this concern, the Committee on Public Accounts has introduced a legislation to compel the executive to enforce the implementation of the outcome of the Auditor General's report submitted to the National Assembly for consideration. Attention will be on the National Assembly to see if this legislation will be passed before the expiration of the 9th Assembly. Let's take a look at some major happenings in the National Assembly during the week.
Days before the former Deputy Senate President Ike Ekweremadu was sentenced by the Central Criminal Court, Old Bailey, London, the House of Representatives and the Senate appealed to the court for leniency in the sentencing of Senator Ike Ekweremadu and his wife, Mrs. Beatrice Ekweremadu. However, at the sentencing hearing on Friday, May 5th, Senator Ekweremadu was jailed for 9 years, 8 months. His wife Beatrice was sentenced to 4 years and 6 months imprisonment while the doctor, Mr. Obeta, received a 10-year prison term. The sentencing follows their conviction in March for organ trafficking. The Ekweremadu's sick daughter, Sonia, was cleared of any wrongdoing. The deputy minority leader urged the House to appeal to the government of the United Kingdom to tamper justice with mercy.
My honorable colleagues, bring the full weight of this parliament, formally, informally, and ask the British government to remember, and the Justice Department to remember the long-term relations we've had with them.
I'm going to use the opportunity to speak directly to the Crown and the British courts and judicial system, not in a bid to absolve former Senate President for any offenses he may have committed, but to plead for clemency.
A lawmaker in the Senate, Senator Chukwuka Utazi, also urged for clemency in the sentencing of his colleague, Senator Ekweremadu. He recalls that Senator Ekweremadu was a former Deputy Senate President for 12 years and the former Speaker of the ECOWAS Parliament, and has made enormous contributions to the development of democracy in Nigeria, West Africa and beyond. Senator Utazi noted that Senator Ekweremadu and his wife are first-time offenders with no previous criminal record, and that since the matter is in the United Kingdom, a novel approach in sentencing of the convict be adopted by tempering justice with mercy, as the publicity already given to the trial is enough warning to would-be offenders.
Whereas this Senate is not arguing the conviction of the Ekweremadus, as ignorance of the law is no excuse, but we are forced into these circumstances in their bid to save a dying daughter, Sonia. Whereas this Senate is not in any way appealing against the conviction of the Ekweremadus, nevertheless, it is joining them in their allocutus plea by asking for clemency in the coming sentencing 2 days away.
I have written a letter to the British judicial officers or judicial authorities about 2-3 weeks ago, giving the history of Senator Ekweremadu, and that I did on behalf of the Senate.
Former Deputy Senate President of Nigeria's Senate, Ike Ekweremadu, and his wife and a doctor were convicted of organ trafficking by the Old Bailey Court in London, United Kingdom, on the 23rd of March 2023, which scheduled their sentencing for the 5th of May 2023. It is not clear what diplomatic channels have been explored by the Nigerian Parliament, but the House of Representatives appeals that consideration be made for the sake of their daughter, who is sick and in dire need of care from her parents. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Femi Gbajabiamila, has pledged to support amendments aimed at strengthening the Standards Organization of Nigeria for effective control and regulation of products consumed in the country to meet with the international best practices. He stated this at a public hearing by the House Committee on Industry on 2 bills seeking to expand the scope, function and provide stiffer penalties for offenders. Mr. Gbajabiamila encouraged key stakeholders to make meaningful contributions to assist the legislature in its work. The Speaker, through his representatives, stands solidly behind any legislation to improve industry standards in the country.
The bills we'll consider today here seek in different ways to increase the standards organization of Nigeria's wide range of operations and enforcement of penalties to offenders of the law as enshrined in the Standardization Act. The contributions you will make here today as informed stakeholders will help the House of Representatives to make the right decisions in the best interest of the Nigerian people.
The chairman of the committee, Dolakbo Badru, highlights the importance of the bill as it affects the conflict between the Standards Organization of Nigeria and the Nigeria Customs Service.
I see no reason why the job of the customs, and you say customs and excise. In fact, in some climes, they are referred, probably in England, they are referred to revenue, Her Majesty's revenue, and that's what they are. Check for contraband that contraband must not come in, and whatever comes in, you pay whatever duty it is to government. But here, they are the one that checks whether this apple is good for consumption or not. I don't know where they are trained to do that.
Key stakeholders at the public hearing pledged their support for the two bills through various presentations.
We like to, of course, agree with the chairman of industries on the fact that even though the Act allowed us to be represented at the ports of entry, it's not as clear as we want it to be.
You just stated that in the draft B to just organize and test and do everything necessary. We just made it too open that it should be within the ambit of the law.
I told my brother.
The House of Representatives has directed the National Assembly clerk to transmit the bill for constitution amendment to provide for uniform retirement age for judicial officers and pension rights to President Muhammadu Buhari. The decision of the House follows the passage of the bill by the Sokoto State House of Assembly, fulfilling the provisions of Section 9, subsection 2 of the Constitution for two-thirds approval of the state assemblies. The House is further urging the Gombe, Jigawa, Kebbi, Kwara, Plateau and Taraba States Houses of Assembly that are yet to forward their resolution on the bills to do so.
The House is aware that Sokoto State House of Assembly has accordingly forwarded its resolution. The House is therefore convinced that with the approval of Sokoto State House of Assembly, the Constitution 5th Alteration Bill number 20, Uniform Retirement Age for Judicial Officers and Pension Rights in bracket, has met the provisions of Section 9, subsection 2 of the Constitution for passage.
At a separate plenary session during the week, the Speaker of the House of Representatives lent his voice to the plight of Nigerian students being evacuated from crisis-torn Sudan.
Whilst our priority is to ensure the welfare and well-being of our fellow citizens caught in this war, we must further revisit the statutory and other frameworks that have left us seemingly unprepared to respond promptly and effectively.
Following publications in national dailies on the proposed concession of 2 of the national assets, an urgent motion is raised by Honorable Ibrahim Halims, questioning the rationale, considering that a new government would be in place in a few weeks.
The House resolves to call on the federal government to suspend the ongoing process for the concession of the Ajokuta Steel Company Limited and the National Iron Ore Mining Company for proper stakeholder consultations.
His motion is adopted as the House also resolves to invite the Minister of Mines and Steel for a detailed explanation. There were several critical motions moved on the floor of the House during the week. The first is to stop the planned disbursement of $700 million Cabotage Vessel Finance Fund and investigate the total accrual of the fund.
Since the establishment of the Cabotage Vessel Finance Fund in the year 2003, there is no record of any Nigerian citizen or company who have officially benefited from the fund as stated in the Act.
The second was on the need for the Niger Delta Development Commission to complete abandoned hospitals and road projects in the region.
Aware that in 2004, the NDDC awarded contracts for the construction of 2 24-bed space standard comprehensive health center, one at Ikorodosium community and the other at Ikorodom Bank community. Worried that despite the contract review, the projects are yet to be completed and put into use due to the non-release of funds by the NDDC.
On Thursday, May 4th, a lawmaker, Representative Leki Abejide, moved a motion of urgent national importance, drawing the attention of the House to what he describes as irregularities in the voters' register as observed during the general elections.
This is where we call it a day on this week's edition of The Gavel. If you have any views on any of the issues discussed, please email us on thegavel@channelstv.com. Thank you for staying with us and see you again next week.